Jimmy Fallon stunned when Sandra Bullock suddenly rushes into audience after seeing this woman that night on The Tonight Show stage. Sandra Bullock stood up from her chair and walked into the audience. Not after a segment ended. Not when she was invited to. Mid-interview, while Jimmy Fallon was still holding his index card, while the band was still quiet, while 300 people were still settling into the rhythm of a normal conversation. She walked past the edge of the desk, down the 3 steps off the stage into the aisle, and stopped in front of a woman in the 7th row who had both hands pressed over her mouth. Jimmy Fallon stood up. He put the index card down. He did not pick it up again for the rest of the night. The segment producer standing in the stage left corridor said later that she had been in television for 17 years and had never once seen a guest leave the interview set mid-sentence and not come back. The Tonight Show control room still talks about what happened that night. It was a Wednesday evening in September. The Tonight Show was running a standard booking. Sandra Bullock in the guest chair for the first time in 3 years. Relaxed, funny. The kind of interview that reminds an audience why they liked someone before they had a reason to like them again. The audience had come from across the tri-state area, the kind of crowd that arrives early, couples in their 60s who had won tickets through a radio station, women who had come in groups of 3 on the train from Long Island, a few retired school teachers who had taken the day off from whatever retirement looks like. They were not expecting anything other than a good hour. Sandra Bullock had walked out to a standing ovation and sat down, and the first 5 minutes were exactly what everyone in the room had hoped for. Warm and quick and real. Everything was exactly right. The lighting was set. The band was loose. The audience was with her. And then a woman in the 7th row, who had been sitting with her hands folded in her lap since the taping began, caught Sandra Bullock's eye across the full width of the studio floor, and everything that had been exactly right became something else entirely. Sandra was mid-sentence. Something about a recent trip, something light, the kind of story that earns a laugh and moves on. Her eyes swept the audience the way performers' eyes do, not reading faces, just feeling the room. And then they stopped. Row 7. Aisle seat. A woman in her mid-70s, small, wearing a blue cardigan, sitting very still with her hands folded. Sandra Bullock's sentence stopped in the middle of a word. Not a pause, a stop. Her eyes went wide and then narrowed and then wide again, the way eyes do when the brain is running a check it didn't expect to need. Jimmy Fallon saw her face change. He looked at the audience, then back at her. Sandra? She was already standing. Not slowly, not theatrically. She was on her feet and moving before she had made any visible decision to move, the way the body acts when the mind has handed something over to instinct. She came down the steps from the stage and walked into the aisle and stopped in front of the woman in row 7. The woman had both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were full. She had not made a sound. Sandra Bullock crouched down in front of her seat, right there in the aisle of The Tonight Show, and said barely above a whisper, caught perfectly by the clip mic she was still wearing, "Eleanor, how are you here right now?" The entire studio froze. For a long moment, no one spoke. The audience didn't know whether to look at Sandra or at the woman or at Jimmy Fallon, who was standing at the edge of the stage with both hands at his sides, looking exactly like a man who has realized the show has become something he is no longer in charge of. A few people near row 7 leaned in without meaning to. Was this planned? Was something wrong? Had someone fainted? Questlove's drumstick sat motionless above the snare. The director in the booth did not cut to commercial. 300 people held their breath. The woman in the blue cardigan lowered her hands from her mouth, very slowly, and looked at Sandra Bullock crouching in front of her with the focused, unhurried expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and has decided to be fully present for it now that it has arrived. She said one word back. Quietly, without performance. Surprise. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1977. Sandra Bullock wasn't always Sandra Bullock, the name and the laugh that belongs to everyone. In September of 1977, in Nuremberg, Germany, a woman named Eleanor Krauss was 43 years old and running the children's choir program at a performing arts school attached to the American military community. She was the wife of a U.S. Army logistics officer and had spent 15 years moving between bases across Europe. And at every base she had done the same thing. Found the children who needed a place, built them a program, and stayed until the orders came to move again. She was not a celebrated teacher. She was not trained in any conservatory. She had a degree in music education from a state college in Ohio, and a quality of patience that people who knew her described the same way, every time, without coordinating on the word, bottomless. She was the kind of teacher who remembered not just what you could do, but what you were afraid of, and who understood that those two things were usually connected. That fall, a 12-year-old girl named Sandra was placed in Eleanor's choir. Her mother, Helga, was an opera singer, professionally trained, European, exacting in the way that people who have mastered something difficult can sometimes be exacting with beginners. Sandra could sing. She had her mother's ear and her mother's instincts. What she did not have, at 12, was any confidence that any of it was hers rather than inherited. She had spent years performing in her mother's world, on her mother's terms, in the shadow of a talent so established that her own felt like an imitation. She arrived at Eleanor's choir on a Tuesday afternoon in September, looking like a child who had learned to take up exactly the right amount of space, and not 1 inch more. Eleanor watched her for 2 weeks before she said anything specific. She watched the way Sandra stood during rehearsals, always slightly behind the row she'd been placed in, as if half ready to step backward if necessary. She watched the way she sang when she thought no one was listening, versus the way she sang when she knew she was being evaluated. There was a difference, a significant one, not in the voice, in the body, in the decision the body made each time about how much to release. On a Thursday in October, Eleanor kept Sandra after rehearsal. The rest of the children had gone, and the room was quiet, and Eleanor sat down at the piano and played a single chord and said, without preamble, "You're hiding." Sandra said nothing. Eleanor said, "Not from me, from yourself. And you've been doing it long enough that you think it's just how you sing. It isn't." She played another chord. "I want you to sing the first line of the piece we're working on. Just the first line. And I want you to do it like your mother is never going to hear it." Sandra looked at her. Then she sang the first line. And Eleanor closed her eyes, because what came out of the girl in that moment was not an imitation of anything. It was entirely, unmistakably, only hers. When the line ended, Eleanor opened her eyes and said, "That's the voice. That's the one we're going to work with." For 2 years, Eleanor Krauss taught Sandra Bullock not just how to perform, but how to be the origin of something, rather than the echo of it. It was a lesson Sandra would spend the rest of her career applying to everything that was not music. In the spring of 1979, Eleanor's husband received new orders. The family was being transferred to a base in South Korea. Eleanor finished the school year and left in June. Sandra was 14. They said goodbye in the rehearsal room with the upright piano and the folding chairs, and Sandra gave her a card she had made herself with a drawing of the two of them at the piano. And Eleanor kept it in the same manila envelope for 46 years. She tracked Sandra's career from a distance the way teachers track the careers of students they are proud of and do not want to embarrass by claiming credit, quietly, privately, with a specific kind of satisfaction that has no need to be seen. She had her own life, children, grandchildren, a husband who retired from the Army in 1994. She had moved back to Ohio. She had kept teaching, locally in a church program, until her knees made standing at a piano for 2-hour rehearsals impractical. She was 78 now. Her husband had passed in 2021. Her daughter, who knew the whole story and had heard it at the dinner table more times than she could count, had reached out to a Tonight Show producer in January. The correspondence had taken 8 months. The Tonight Show staff had been told only that a specific audience member had a historical connection to the evening's guest. They had not been told what it was or what Sandra Bullock would do when she saw her. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, Sandra Bullock had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. She had known since the previous week that Eleanor Krauss would be in the audience. A member of her team had brought her the correspondence, and she had read it twice and then put it down and not spoken about it for the rest of that day. She had told the Tonight Show producers only that she needed to handle the moment herself, in whatever way the moment required, and that they should not plan around it or build a segment out of it or announce it. She wanted to see Eleanor's face across a room first. She wanted the distance between them before she crossed it. She had not seen Eleanor Krauss since June of 1979. She had looked for her, twice, in the early years of her career, and found nothing searchable in the pre-internet way that names disappear into married names and moved addresses. She had assumed, without deciding to assume, that the searching was finished. It turned out the searching had 46 more years to run. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Sandra Bullock was crouching in the aisle of The Tonight Show in front of a woman in a blue cardigan, and the woman had said one word, surprise. And now Sandra was reaching into the inner pocket of the jacket she was wearing and producing a piece of folded paper. The audience did not understand yet what they were looking at. Jimmy Fallon, still standing at the edge of the stage, understood that whatever was happening had its own timeline, and that his job, for the first time in years of hosting, was simply to not interrupt it. "I've carried this since 2003, Sandra said. She unfolded the paper. It was a photograph, printed from a digital scan, the original too fragile to travel. A 12-year-old girl and a woman in their early 40s, standing beside an upright piano in a room with folding chairs, squinting slightly into a flash. Eleanor Krauss looked at it, and her breath left her in a long, slow way that was not quite a sigh and not quite a sob. "I had the card you made me," Sandra said. "I found out you kept it." "Of course I kept it," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, in the way that voices are steady when the emotion behind them is too large for trembling. "You were the reason I kept teaching." Sandra looked at her. "You were the reason I kept going." She sat down in the empty seat beside Eleanor, right there in row 7, in the audience of her own Tonight Show appearance, still wearing her clip mic, still in the lights. "I looked for you," Sandra said. "I know," Eleanor said. "My daughter told me. Why didn't you reach out?" Eleanor thought about this for a moment, the way she thought about things when Sandra was 12, and said something that deserved a real answer rather than a fast one. "Because you were doing the work," she said. "I didn't want to interrupt it. That was always the point. You do the work. I just showed you the door." Sandra pressed her hand over Eleanor's folded hands. "You showed me that it was my door." Eleanor looked at her for a long time with the same unhurried attention she had given a 12-year-old girl who was hiding in the back row of a choir in Nuremberg in 1977. Yes, she said simply. It was always yours. Jimmy Fallon had come down off the stage. He was standing in the aisle 2 rows back, not speaking, one hand over his mouth. Questlove had stood up from the drum kit. The cameraman closest to the aisle did not pull back. The director did not cut to commercial. The standing ovation started in the rows closest to row 7 and moved outward through the studio like a wave that had been building for 46 years and had finally found the shore. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Eleanor Krauss returned to Ohio the following morning with her daughter, who had driven down from Columbus for the taping, and who said afterward that she had never seen her mother look the way she looked leaving that studio. Not younger exactly, but settled. The way a person looks when something they have carried for a long time has been received by the person it was always meant for. Sandra Bullock visited Eleanor in Ohio the following spring, quietly, without announcement, on a Tuesday that did not make the news. They sat at Eleanor's kitchen table for 3 hours. Eleanor played the upright piano she still kept in the back room, the same upright, shipped back from base to base and finally to Ohio, the one she had played every chord of her teaching life on. Sandra sang the first line of the piece they had worked on together in Nuremberg in the fall of 1977. She sang it the way Eleanor had taught her to sing it, like no one who came before her would ever hear it. Only hers. The photograph from The Tonight Show, Sandra crouching in the aisle, Eleanor with both hands over her mouth, was framed and placed on the wall of Eleanor's back room beside the piano, where it remains. Jimmy Fallon mentioned the night once, in passing, during a year-end reflection he gave to his staff before the holiday break. He said some nights remind you that the show is just the room, and what matters is who walks into it. He did not use Eleanor's name. He didn't need to. Some doors you spend a lifetime walking through before you realize someone left them open for you on purpose, 46 years ago, in a room with folding chairs and a piano, in a city far from home.